Well, welcome everybody. Ooh, it's quite loud here. It's great to have you all here in our wonderful home. I still think of it as our new home here at the Hopkins Bloomberg Center, in this remarkable setting, an incredible setting of the view behind us of Capitol Hill, which isn't present at the moment, as we continue to observe the shutdown here and think a little bit about governance. This is a very special event for me and for SAIS. To host the Brzezinski Lecture. For those of you who've been here before, you know that this really means quite a lot to me. But I want to begin by thanking the Brzezinski family for their incredible support and engagement with us and the continuing honoring of Zbig's legacy here. And it's particularly pleased to see Ian, an old friend and colleague from many experiences back, but all of the family and friends here. Charles Gotti, who's been so instrumental and played a big role in both helping us have Zbig here and continuing his legacy here, and so many other friends and supporters of SAIS who are here for this event. As I said, it's very special for me and for SAIS because of the incredible contributions that Zbig made during his life and his time here. As most of you know, he spent considerable time here after he finished his formal public service, and both as a teacher and as a mentor and a convener of SAIS, and really is legendary in the impact that he made here. And so it seems particularly appropriate and fitting that we're able to honor him with this lecture series, which has allowed us to bring some very extraordinary individuals to talk about the big issues of the day. And this one is, more special than others. Every year, I think, we found the perfect Brzezinski lecturer, but boy, did we ever find the perfect Brzezinski lecturer for this particular event. And in addition to the fact that we have a tremendous friend and one of the most influential writers on international affairs here with us, Edward Luce, who's been a friend and somebody I've looked to and admired for a long time. But to be able to do this in the year celebrating his remarkable biography of Zbig, which I'm sure most of you have already seen here, but if you haven't, you must read it. I mean, I'm a great consumer of biographies of people who work in international affairs and national security, but this is a remarkable tour de force that Ed has created here. And I'm particularly pleased about the fact that we were able to make a small contribution to the creation of this book, because with the support of Michael Parkinson, who was a SAIS alumnus and a former student of Dr. Brzezinski, the Brzezinski Biography Project funded the work of the Ed's research assistant, Gibbs McKinley, as well as providing support through Stephen Hines and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund to support translations of the archival materials. And so we, in our small way, made a contribution in addition to having the opportunity to have here to talk about this book. And he's not going to talk about the book, but to have the opportunity to celebrate the book and Dr. Brzezinski's life. And so the opportunity to sort of think about the impact of how Zbig's thinking about the world and his really capacious view about geopolitics really has lessons for us that have really proved very enduring and very powerful. So it's really great for me to be here and really grateful to the leadership of Carla Freeman, who has been the host and our new director of the Foreign Policy Institute here, which is the home of the Brzezinski Lecture. So I'm going to turn it over to Ed, who's going to talk for a while, then we'll chat for a bit, and then we'll open up to your questions as well. But it really is a signal honor to me. I see John Altman is there too. I want to welcome you. To have everybody here for this event and to listen to Ed's remarkable insights, drawing on the incredible insights of Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Thank you so much. Keeping this for the time, I'll speak for, about half an hour? Roughly. Thank you, Jim. That was a lovely introduction. It's a perfect venue for it, as you mentioned. Brzezinski Annual Lecture, what could be better place for me to talk about my biography of Brzezinski. And of course, he taught at SAIS. And I got to know him a little bit in the aughts, do we say aughts or aughties? At the brown bag SAIS lunch that he would hold every week when SAIS was on Mass Avenue. And he was a pretty formidable host of a lunch, so if you spoke, you were careful what you said. And I know that students of his from SAIS, from Columbia, from Harvard, if they got an A, there was 1 A per class, and it was by letter, then they would often sort of frame it. They would treasure it. He was Brzezinski was the opposite of grade inflation. And so by pure sort of mathematical deduction, there are a lot more students who are deeply traumatized for life by having been given low grades or failing grades by Dr. Brzezinski. It's also a great pleasure to have members of Dr. Brzezinski's family here, not least Amelia, his granddaughter, her dad, Jim, his oldest son, Ian, and his wife, Ginny. It's wonderful to see you, thank you. And Mika's great friend, Laura. And also people who've helped a lot with the book, who I recognize in the audience, namely Toby and Charles Gatti, sitting just here, great stalwarts of SAIS. And you mentioned John, who's the CSIS Brzezinski chair, so great to see you here. Now, if you think of the life of Brzezinski from the other side of the Atlantic, he plays a much more dramatic role than he does here in people's imaginations about the 20th century and about the Cold War. Most of all in Russia, where he is the sort of arch enemy, almost cartoonish still. Just a few years ago, Nikolai Patrushev, Putin's then national security advisor, said that the Soviet Union lost the Cold War because of the CIA and Brzezinski. And of course, Putin described that event famously as the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. Now, I think Patrushev was somewhat exaggerating Brzezinski's role. Lots of things led to the unraveling of the Soviet Union. But he was, I think, as undervalued in Washington, D.C. as he's overvalued in Moscow. I think partly that's because he's, I believe, unfairly overshadowed by Henry Kissinger, his sort of frenemy and arch rival. And again, more about that later. A few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, in fact, bearing in mind the sort of massive name that is Brzezinski, the other side of the Atlantic, I gave the annual Isaiah Berlin lecture in Riga. Now, some of you might not have heard, some of the students here, maybe a few of the scholars might not know much about Isaiah Berlin, and we were discussing that earlier. He was one of the great intellectual influences on my life. I guess one of the great 20th century British philosophers, liberal philosophers, who grew up in Riga, moved to St. Petersburg. His family sort of moved there. The revolution happened. And in 1919, the family fled St. Petersburg back to the Russian Empire altogether and the Soviet Empire altogether to cross the sea to Britain, age 12. And he went on to become one of the sort of stalwarts of Oxford philosophy. I would say the John Stuart Mill in Britain of the 20th century. Now, Brzezinski left Poland aged 10 in 1938, shortly after the notorious Munich Agreement between Hitler and Chamberlain and others, crossed the Atlantic, like Berlin, escaping a totalitarian world, escaping something that was utterly formative for their sort of biographical, what happened later in their lives. And for Berlin, the idea that he took with him and that became the sort of famous sort of core of his philosophy, two concepts of liberty, the hedgehog and the fox, etc. For Berlin, it was that any kind of totalitarianism, whether it's secular, whether it's religious, communist, Christian, whatever it might be, any system of thought in which the people who hold it believe that no sacrifice is too great in order to open the gates of paradise, that they have the answer. That's what he fled, and that was the sort of core of his very sort of flinty, pragmatic philosophy. And I believe that what was philosophically core to Berlin was geopolitically core to Brzezinski. I was asked to do this biography during COVID, And I thought, well, it'll be a nice distraction, a fascinating tour into a very important, undervalued person's life. But it'll be a distraction, and I was completely wrong, a distraction from my day job at the Financial Times, which is writing about the geopolitics of today. And in fact, it was quite the opposite. I took from this, I sort of finally understood that Winston Churchill cliche aphorism, that the further back you look, the further forward you can see, that history is not only not dead, but it's a really essential tool for exploring and understanding the times in which we live. The times today are arguably multipolar. The times that Brzezinski and Kissinger sparred with each other were bipolar. But the relevance of history, of comparison, of a non-metric history, I mean, you know the joke about economics has physics envy. Well, sometimes I have the suspicion history has economics envy. A lot of history is really completely unreadable. But the relevance of the sort of very complex stakes that Brzezinski had in his life were really useful to my day job. So let me start with just a tiny bit of his history, because I want to get on to what it meant to be a strategist, and what that means to us today in this, what I call this age of the revenge of geopolitics. Brzezinski was 10, as I mentioned, when he crossed the Atlantic. He was born in 1928 in Warsaw, the year that Stalin was consolidating power in Moscow, 9 years after Berlin left St. Petersburg. And he was born really in the middle of this very brief flowering of the Polish Second Republic, this long suppressed nation that had been divided between Tsarist Russia, Habsburgs, the Prussians, had been given rebirth as a Second Republic by the American president, Woodrow Wilson, at the Treaty of Versailles, his 13th point out of the 14 points. And midway, really, between its rebirth and its death in 1939. He left a year before the Polish Second Republic's death. And it ended, of course, with the beginning of the Second World War, the Molotov-Ribbentrop secret protocol, the Nazi-Soviet pact. So Hitler finds a false flag operation, a pretext, invades from the west. The Soviets, a few days later, invade from the east, and this brutal vivisection of the country a 10-year-old Brzezinski had left a year before, fully expecting to return to, becomes the first sort of theater of total war, of blitzkrieg. And he was at night in Montreal, where his dad, Tadeusz, Ian's granddad, was the Polish consul general, and he'd been very canny in getting himself posted there. No educated Pole of that time was ignorant of what was likely coming. And Tadeusz was a very keen student of history, knew exactly what was coming. And so Montreal was not a promotion for him, but it was an absolute sort of godsend for him and his family that they were there a year later when these Stukas start sort of scream dive bombing Warsaw. And I have the great fortune via the family of having the young, by then 11-year-olds of Brzezinski's diaries in Polish, handwritten, needed to be deciphered and translated. And he writes every night of blow by blow the opening stages of the Second World War and these streets that he knew of Warsaw, which he'd grown up being a Polish Boy Scout on, being utterly destroyed, and just the horror of it. And they listened, he and his dad, and his mother would listen to Radio Warsaw every night and get reports of it. And after about 2 weeks, Radio Warsaw went silent, except for the first 11 notes of a Polonaise by Chopin, the Polish composer. And then one night, that Polonaise was replaced by Deutschland über alles. And for him, that was, in writing his diary, the sort of very, and his mother's diaries, which are also available to me, an almost more important moment, that sort of change of sound of the guillotine coming down on his world. And I emphasize this because, history is not just impersonal structural forces. It is also what individuals do, and their messy, sort of ad hoc, contingent, accidental interaction with the world. And Brzezinski's interaction with the world, really importantly, for formative years, is absolutely forged by this. He goes on to do this postgraduate degree at McGill University in Montreal. And I'm also going to emphasize that because the postgraduate thesis he did is extremely rare in a 22-year-old's life, that you get such an important pointer to how the rest of his life or her life will unfold. That here you have the kernel, the sort of microcosm of his methods as a Sovietologist, which he went on to become a luminary, but also his practice as a national security advisor in the Carter administration and as this sort of foreign policy strategist throughout the Cold War. And it's entitled Russo-Soviet Nationalism. It's about 150 pages. And in those 150 pages, he basically blows up current prevailing Sovietology, which is framed around the early Cold War strategy, that of George Kennan, the strategy of containment, which he famously unfurled anonymously as X in a Foreign Affairs article, The Sources of Soviet Conduct. And that containment strategy was about stopping the Eastern Bloc moving west. The Soviets had taken the so-called captive nations, Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc. But thus far and no further, that was the point of containment. And Brzezinski didn't dispute containment, but he pointed out it had nothing to say about what happened the other side of the Iron Curtain, about what the future of the Soviet bloc would be. And he identified, and this is the master's thesis that he wrote, he identified the Soviet Union's Achilles heel, and that Achilles heel was the nations, not just the captive nations, which did feel occupied, particularly Poland, given its history with Moscow, but also the republics within the USSR, the Ukrainians, the Georgians, the Baltic, newly reoccupied Baltics, the Kazakhs, Armenians, etc. That these people not only didn't feel Soviet, he famously asked in this, do they speak Soviet? Is there such a language as Soviet? But they felt that they were part of a Russian empire that was dressed up as a Marxist, and it was a very clearly Marxist communist enterprise, but that it was a Russifying empire in Soviet vocabulary. And he went through each of these. He went through the data for the party elites in each of these republics within the USSR and showed how the native-speaking Georgians and so forth would get supplanted by Russians who would come in. And in the Holodomor, the famine in Ukraine, which killed millions of people, by the end of that, the number of Russians who'd moved in to replace the Ukrainians who died of this disastrous collectivization of agriculture changed the nature of the population. Party leadership became Russian. They were sent in from Moscow. And he went through this pretty methodically. It's very unusual that a 20-year-old's master's thesis gets noticed anywhere, but it was a really arrogant challenge to the prevailing consensus. And the prevailing consensus at this fledgling Cold War university system, that, as it was then called, or was subsequently dubbed, of Harvard, Columbia, etc., the prevailing consensus was the Soviet Union was a monolith and that we must accept the reality of Homo Sovieticus, the new man. Whether we like it or not, we must take that as a starting point. And he said, this is rubbish. And as I say, it was very arrogant, but it gives you a through line of his biography up till at least 1989. He got to Harvard, as I mentioned, didn't become a great rival with Kissinger then, although that's sort of become the legend. Kissinger got tenure, Brzezinski didn't, but they weren't competing for the same job. And Kissinger was a diplomatic historian, not a Sovietologist, so they weren't really in the same silos. But he pioneered this school of comparative communism, which flowed on from that thesis at McGill. And Columbia offered him a job after he lost tenure, but was denied tenure at Harvard. Set up School of Russian Studies and of comparative communism, where you would compare the different reactions of each country to Sovietization. Some were deeply Sovietized. Others, like Poland, were resisting it. They didn't collectivize most of their agriculture. The church was... So he said, this is a tool that policymakers need to be making use of as America tries to sort of update and improve its Cold War strategy. And he, of course, academia was a stepping stone. He used this to get articles in Foreign Affairs. He was in New York now to write speeches for candidate, then President John F. Kennedy, sort of made himself known that way, and then inveigled himself with really very sly maneuvers into Lyndon Johnson's thoughts in 1967. He'd been given in 66 actually, he'd been given a junior sort of secondment at the Policy and Planning Council unit at the State Department, Policy and Planning, where you'd ordinarily go and be forgotten and write worthy stuff and nobody would read it. And he managed to write something that he got President Johnson to speak, which is very, very difficult. And the way he did that was he said that Robert F. Kennedy, and I must stress senior, it's a very different kind too for the young people here. Do not think when I say RFK, I'm talking about medicine or vaccines or anything. Because Robert F. Kennedy was going to give a speech on the same subject the next week, and LBJ dreaded Robert Kennedy. And so that was enough. LBJ's staff thought, well, we've got no real Cold War strategy at the moment because it's all about Vietnam. It's moved from Europe, from transatlantic, to the jungles of Southeast Asia. And here's this young guy from State, and he's got an idea. And his idea flowed from what he'd been doing at Columbia and in foreign affairs and his sort of presence as an intellectual increasingly on the public stage, which was peaceful engagement with Eastern Europe, bridge building. Now, I've got experts in the audience here, Charles being one of them, who know a lot more about this than I do, even after having researched this book. But this was quite a subtle strategy, belied by Brzezinski's later reputation as being a hawk. This was about peaceful bridge building that went through Prague and Bucharest and Warsaw, rather than Moscow. But in order to allow these people-to-people contacts, these sports and cultural, but also commercial and technological exchanges that he was saying America needed to embark upon, Moscow needed to be relaxed. And relaxing Moscow and relaxing these countries meant accepting post-war borders, meant accepting that that bit of Germany that Poland was given to make up for the larger bit of Poland that was taken to its east, that has to be recognized by the Federal Republic, by West Germany. You cannot have this German, remember this is the 60s, Damocles' sword hanging over Eastern Europe. Likewise, the Germans must renounce that Germans from the Sudetenland be given the right to go back home in Czechoslovakia. These ghosts are too recent, too real. We have to recognize these borders. So Moscow needs to be relaxed in order for this opening up, this stimulating, this cultivating of this Achilles heel, this weakness of the Soviet Union to go ahead. And LBJ gave this speech. And I don't think he well, Brzezinski wrote, but others wrote. He didn't really know the speech he was giving, what impact it would have. And in that speech, he said, we must recognize post-war borders. And that partly led to the downfall of Ludwig Erhard's government in West Germany. America had abandoned their sort of core position, and that contributed to the weakness. Erhard ended Christian Democrat monopoly on power that had existed since the war. So for a young, thrusting, somewhat unconventional, very much not foreign service officer type person in the State Department to get the president to do this, I think shows you how strongly he felt this should be America's Cold War strategy. Now, leap forward to Carter administration. 1977, this very unlikely relationship between a Georgian governor and this sort of Machiavellian Polish-American. One a Sunday school preacher, the other an absolute sort of hardcore geostrategist. But one of the closest relationships in modern American history in a White House relation, one of the most consequential. And Carter inherited a world in which Vietnam was no longer the albatross around a president's neck. It had been for the previous few presidencies. America had been on the ideological defensive. Now it was ready to go back on the offensive ideologically. And it was Brzezinski's strategy, by and large, that Carter picked up. And the thing that he weaponized was human rights. That was the year, incidentally, that Amnesty International won the Nobel Prize. It was, the year that these watch groups were sprouting all across the Eastern Bloc. It was the year of Andrei Sakharov, the famous nuclear physicist dissident. And it was the year of Helsinki watch groups. And Helsinki Final Act had recognized in 1975 the post-war borders, but it had also sort of slipped in this human rights third basket. The Soviets were told, reassured by Kissinger, and I think he meant it, this is small print, don't pay any attention. This freedom of movement, freedom of religion, freedom of expression doesn't mean anything. Carter decided to take it literally, as did some of these civic dissident groups, Samizdat, etc., and they weaponized it. And the, I suppose, apotheosis of this weaponization was the solidarity movement in Poland in 1980, towards the end of Carter's term in office, which was very nearly the beginning of if not the Third World War, a dramatic decline in East-West relations. A much, much more dangerous thing would have happened if the Soviets had invaded Poland than had happened in 1968 when they invaded Czechoslovakia to suppress liberalization going on there, and in Hungary in 1956. And one of the reasons why this movement, which had been born in August of 1980 in the Lenin shipyards in Gdansk, there was a worker was unfairly fired, and it was a spark that lit the fire of deep frustration. Within 3 months, there were 10 million members of Solidarity in a population of 35 million total. This was a mortal threat to the Soviet Union. It was a workers' movement that was against the workers' paradise. It was absolutely incomprehensible in Moscow how this could be happening. And not only was it a workers' movement, which was unnecessary in a Soviet system, but its icon was a religious figure, Pope John Paul II, a Polish pope. This was extremely dangerous. So Brzezinski set about with his relationship with Pope John Paul II, the first non-Italian pope in 453 years, who Brzezinski knew a little bit before he became pope. And you've got the first Polish-speaking American foreign policy sort of strategist, and so far the last in the White House, that they talked the whole time. I was fortunate enough to get their correspondence, and which was endless. And Brzezinski, so close were they, so frequently did they talk that Brzezinski had P for Pope on his White House phone. He pressed P, and Pope would pick up, so kind of weird. And they managed to convince Moscow, Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, that Poland wasn't Hungary, it wasn't Czechoslovakia, it was indigestible, it was a porcupine. And the reason was because, unlike Prague in 1968 and Hungary in 1956, this wasn't chiefly dissidents and students protesting the Soviet system. It was the workers, the church, and parts of the army, as well as the students and the dissidents. And they succeeded in Again, a slightly paradoxical strategy, because at the same time they were calling the Solidarity leader, Lech Walesa, and asking him to tone down his rhetoric. But they were also getting Carter and other Western leaders, Margaret Thatcher, Giscard d'Estaing, to issue these strong statements saying there will be consequences if you invade Poland. And there were 16 Soviet divisions on the border. They'd set up blood transfusion sites. It was going to happen. So 9 years after that, of course, Carter loses. 9 years after that, the Cold War ends. And I think we all have it in our head that the Cold War ended when the Berlin Wall fell, and I think that's a fair date to choose, November the 9th, 1989. But I would suggest June the 4th, 1989 is the real date. That's the date that an ailing Polish bankrupt government that needs Western loans had agreed to hold circumscribed elections in which Solidarity was competing with them. And Solidarity won 99 out of 100 seats. So the original plan is, well, we'll have a coalition with them. They can have the Ministry of Youth and Culture. They just swept the board. It became impossible to deny. And so the Polish leader, Jaruzelski, who was talking a lot to Brzezinski at this point, and Gorbachev, the then Soviet leader, the last Soviet leader, agreed, let them form a government, and they formed a government a few weeks later. That was when the Cold War ended. That's when the Soviet Union ceded its monopoly on power, which was the essence of its system. And it was really the culmination of the thesis that Brzezinski had written in 1950. This is an extraordinary thing, as I say, for any significant person's biography, to get it laid out so young. Now, history is also about, it's not just, as I mentioned earlier, about sort of the grander sort of trends and forces, though it is. It's also about the quirkiness of individuals. And the Kissinger-Brzezinski relationship is utterly fascinating, and it's utterly seminal. And I think given the sort of decades over which they sparred, their dialogue, you know, is sort of up there amongst the great dialogues. Brzezinski crossed the Atlantic in 1938, as did Kissinger. Kissinger was 15. And from the 60s onwards, but really 1968, when Nixon said, I'm choosing this foreign-born guy with a funny accent to be my national security advisor, the highest you could get as a naturalized American. Since 1968, the rivalry had become a bit more acute, and Brzezinski saw what he could reach. And essentially, they represented the two different schools. They were the sort of formers and faces of the two different schools of how to strategize during the Cold War. Very, very different. Kissinger believed, because of the horrendousness of his family history, most of them died in the Holocaust. He believed stability was an overriding priority. And stability meant, in this horrifying nuclear age that people were living through, that you've got to have some kind of a modus vivendi with the Soviet Union. And he drew this from his diplomatic work on the 1815 Congress of Vienna that Metternich and Castlereagh and so forth, that had been his sort of great work as a diplomatic historian, that compact between big legitimizing powers was the key to global order. And he was famously asked, if you had to choose between justice and order, which would you go for? And he said, order every time. So SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and other sort of, and détente, of course, relaxation, literally, between the Soviets and the Americans, was absolutely sort of core to Kissinger. And he was very successful in getting that done in Nixon's 1.5 terms and Ford's half term. But it was based on a very pessimistic assumption. And that pessimism was that the Soviet Union is catching up with us technologically and economically. Something a lot of people had felt since 1957, since Sputnik, since the Soviets were the first to launch a satellite, but would become quite mainstream in academia, at Langley, amongst analysts, that this convergence, the Soviet Union was converging on America's standard of living. So the thing to do is reach a modus vivendi with them. They're going to be around a long time. Brzezinski took the opposite view, and he also not just took the opposite view in terms of being optimistic about America's technological performance, which he tested on many, many trips to the Soviet Union. And he'd learned Russian, and he'd argue with people. But he saw the sort of drabness and the grayness, the lack of car brands. There were no computers. And coined this phrase, reverse natural selection, that you only got promoted in the Soviet system if you didn't innovate. So natural selection, of course, picks out innovation. This was reverse natural selection. And so he was very optimistic about the United States' ability, except in nuclear weapons technology, to leave the Soviet Union in the dust. And he described the Soviet Union as a museum to industrial history. And therefore took, Kissinger saw it through the eyes of big players, Kissinger and Brzezinski through small players, naturally, partly because of his Polishness, but also as the Achilles heel to accelerate what he saw as the inevitable demise of the USSR. These were two very different schools of thought. Both had a lot going for them. But in talking about Isaiah Berlin, I think I mentioned The Hedgehog and the Fox earlier. Hedgehog and the Fox is one of probably his most famous essay, in which Berlin says that the hedgehog knows one big thing, how to protect itself. And the fox is cunning, knows tons of different things, wily, and just cunning. And I think it got transposed in Britain to Churchill. I mean, he'd actually written this about, Berlin was writing about Tolstoy and Turgenev and Russian authors, but it quickly got transposed onto Churchill. Churchill being the hedgehog. The guy got all the small things wrong. First World War military tactics, India, Ireland, the gold standard, you have it, you name it. But the one big thing right, which was the transcendent sort of nature of the Nazi fascist threat. When all the foxes got everything else right, but they were with Chamberlain in Munich. That was the fox position. And so that's transposed in that. And I think if you look at the Cold War, and I'm deliberately not looking at Brzezinski's other influences and acts as a public figure, I'm sort of taking the most important one, but in many areas he really, really got things wrong, Iran being one. But on the Cold War, if you look at Brzezinski and Kissinger, then Brzezinski is clearly the hedgehog, and Kissinger is clearly the fox. Now, I'm not going to, I've got this clock to keep an eye on the time, I'm not going to speak too much about his post-Cold War role, which was very important, the expansion of NATO, becoming a sort of unlikely and late in life darling of the left after 9/11, opponent of the Iraq War, key endorser of Obama. I mean, this was all very unusual for Brzezinski because during the Carter years, he was known as Darth Vader by people on the left. That being the time of, when Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, etc., was in our movie theaters. I won't go too much into that because we can get into that and its applications to today. But let me just sort of close on an anecdote about Brzezinski and Kissinger. So I got to know Dr. Brzezinski reasonably well in the last 12 years of his life. Although he didn't know neither did I, going to write a biography of him. That was several years after he died. And he died in May 2017. And Kissinger died in November, aged 100, in November 2023. And again, I got to know him a bit, and he was very generous with his time in me interviewing him for this book. I remember asking him, and I put this in the book, where would you rank Brzezinski as amongst the sort of Cold War strategists? And I had in mind a couple of rather cruel comparisons that have been made, which I disagree with, which is that Brzezinski was Salieri to Kissinger's Mozart, which I hope this book redresses a bit. Kissinger said, where does he rank? And he said, well, he was definitely in the top 2. So I'm still wondering who could possibly have been number 1. But then he went on to say, look, we had a lot in common. We were rivals. It was contentious over the previous 5-6 decades. But we did agree on certain things. We were both immigrants from the bloodlands of interwar Europe, from this very different world, washed up. He was a refugee. Brzezinski, I guess, was a de facto exile. He could never go back. And we brought with us an idea of the thinness of civilization, how quickly things can fall apart, and of the potential for tragedy. And the idea that history is not something that can be neatly sewed up. It doesn't sort of come to an end. It goes on and on and on. It is a continuous experience, was the word. He sounded like Disney, but a continuous experience. And his idea, and I think Brzezinski's too, was not that America was, in the most exceptionalist sense, the last great hope of mankind. More that it was, you know, the worst possible defender of liberalism, except for all the others. So it was a very sort of flinty idea of what America meant. And I'm not suggesting here that Americans are not capable of thinking like this. George Kennan was very American. Dean Acheson was very American. But he emphasized that as immigrants, you know, who reached the top of, as far as they could go, that they understood that this was a sort of a series of ad hoc challenges we will face indefinitely, because that is the nature of human folly, and that is the nature of human existence. Countries compete, sparks fly, wars loom, and his definition of peace, I think, is a very good one. This is Kissinger, which is the absence of war, and I think that tells you quite a lot. And just sort of final point is that their era was a bipolar era, and no matter how sort of terrifying that was, and it was at various key points, it was, you can imagine the physics when there's two poles, Moscow and Washington, that equilibrium is possible. Some kind of stabilization is conceivable. In a multipolar world, it's a lot more complex, and equilibrium is a lot more difficult. And therefore, we have greater need of strategic thinking, even ones, maybe especially ones who really disagree with each other. And we have greater need to welcome immigrants to universities that are getting federal funding. But then I'm getting on to contemporary politics, so I'll stop there and would love to hear any questions that you've got.
Well, that was fantastic. And you can imagine your last two observations were particularly resonant here, both in the need for great strategic thinking, which hopefully both with our current faculty and our future great strategic thinking students here, that you continue to see the importance of that, but also your observation about immigrants, which are also very important to us. We're very happy. It's been one of the hallmarks of SAIS, both on our faculty and our students, that we are very much a global community and recognize the importance of that. So I appreciate especially those. And before I get to my questions, I do want to remedy one omission in my opening remarks. I also want to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, which has been a great supporter of this lecture series. And so I want to make sure we got that in. So your lecture is titled The Revenge of Geopolitics, and you covered a huge amount of Zbig's work. And so I actually want to open the door on one other piece of it, because when we think about great politics today, we think about China, right? And as you talk about in fabulous discussion in the book about Dr. Brzezinski's role in the normalization of relations with China and his conceptions about this, I want to ask you about sort of what would Zbig think today in terms of this? And I say this with Jim Mann in the audience. Jim and I have had a back and forth, which we both have different views about the answer to that question. But you are the real individual with the insight on it. And you know, he obviously had a very different approach to China in those days. Now, clearly, China was not the kind of pure competitor that the Soviet Union was at that time, has become dramatically more capable and the like. But he also had, you know, put a lot of stock, personal stock, in the development of the relationship. So it's obviously pure speculation, but I wonder how, as you think about his approach to the world, his hedgehogness, as it were, how would that translate into his thinking about the relationship with China and this, particularly this core question that you identified, which is stability versus some of the other fundamental issues that we have with China on human rights and freedom and speech and all of the above?
It's a great and very topical question. Of course, as you mentioned, the Carter administration normalized relations with China, which was a big sort of second act to the Nixon-Kissinger opening. He had to fight a battle with the State Department where Cy Vance wanted nothing to get in the way of another SALT agreement, SALT II. So they are completely different, such different views that the White House was seen as the China camp and Foggy Bottom was seen as the Soviet camp. It was sort of almost that clear. And Brzezinski prevailed in that argument, and relations were normalized. And then in 87, I think it was published 88, but when he was writing his sort of funeral dance for communism in his book, The Grand Failure, which is a sort of, I don't think he was a very good writer, Brzezinski, but this book is really well written. It's a gem of a book. And in it, he sort of explains why the Soviet system failed, and he goes through all the reasons, economic and political. But then there's a chapter making an exception for China, which is China is not going to fail. And one of the reasons is because they've embraced perestroika first, not glasnost. And for the younger ones here, glasnost was opening. It was free speech. It was freedom of religion. Perestroika was economic restructuring. Chinese were all about economic restructuring, not as they saw in another more famous event on June the 4th, 1989 in Tiananmen Square, not particularly about political dissent where they killed so many people. So he said, that's why China will survive and the rest is communism. Here's my funeral speech, here's my eulogy. China didn't have an Achilles heel in his view. For sure there were minorities, as there are suppressed minorities, Uyghurs, Tibetans, etc. But they were a tiny share relative to China of the population compared to the 50% of the USSR, which was non-Russian. And China, broadly speaking, inhabited its historic borders. So he didn't see that as being a tool of breakup either. And those were the two things that killed the Soviet Union: economic stasis and loss of legitimacy amongst the peoples within it. So those two conditions were missing for China. He did become wedded, like Kissinger, to China being, something that's always going to be around. We cannot sort of have regime change. We're just not capable of imposing it. So he became quite cold-blooded. I mean, he was advising Bush Sr. when he was president how to move on from Tiananmen pretty quickly. And I think it's fair to say that Carter believed in human rights for everyone, everywhere. There was a sort of pious, evangelism to it, sort of Southern Baptist thing to it. But Brzezinski was more pragmatic about where human rights mattered, and weaponizing it behind the Iron Curtain was more important, I think, than doing so with China. So as time goes on, that looks, that takes on a very different light to the brilliant geopolitical chessboard move it was at the time to weaken the Soviets. But his thinking did evolve. But they still would roll out not as thick a red carpet for him, but there was a pretty thick red carpet for Brzezinski in China. And so, I'm not sure he would have changed his mind. I think what he would be arguing is that a strategy that, or maybe it's not a strategy, but a presidency that is sort of permitting Russia and China to be such close friends, successive administrations, you need to find a strategy to sort of create a little bit of tension between Russia and China. Driving them into each other's arms is not strategic, it's astrategic.
So on Russia, obviously his strategy was focused around a time there was the Soviet Union. There's no Soviet Union anymore. And in some senses, if the weakness in part was the nationalities in Russia, I mean, there are still some, Chechnya and the South Caucasus and like, but I mean, it's a much more homogeneous country as Russia than it was as the Soviet Union. And we see that Putin is playing the nationalism card very heavily in the way they approach both the sustaining power domestically and identifying the strategies externally. How do you think that would have affected how Dr. Brzezinski would have thought about dealing with Russia today, given the fact that sort of his optimism and these sense of the economic weakness obviously arguably is still there. But would that lead to a different approach? I mean, we'd look at this sort of heavily dependent on kind of Russian identity, going back to all these tropes about, Kiev Rus and all of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, he saw that one of the reasons he became a pessimist so quickly when the Cold War ended was he believed that the West was not, West was too triumphalist, there was too much hubris. The idea of, and this is, I think Fukuyama's book is a great book and it's completely cartoonized, so this isn't a criticism of him. But the cartoonish idea people had in their heads that all arguments are settled, all ideological arguments are over, liberal democracy is the ultimate answer, and great power politics is over, he saw as hopelessly naive. And he became pessimistic that America would sort of encourage the backlash against those who perceived themselves to be losers, what he called the axis of the aggrieved. And he's writing this in 1993, so nobody wants to hear this message in 1993. But that axis of the aggrieved was there in Tianjin with Modi, Putin, an Ayatollah, and the North Koreans. I mean, they were all there in early September. They were there on Red Square in May, as they are most years, but it's getting bigger each year. And that's, I think, what he meant by astrategic thinking, is you can't be pursuing strategies that unite your enemies. You've got to find ways of sort of finding some things in common and holding your nose if you don't like their systems, and realizing that you're not going to carry out regime change, but you can, through going back to the peaceful engagement, there are ways you can influence that are not kinetic. And I think you would be thinking along those lines. But you know, I was very conscious that I'm a columnist and I'm quite used to declarative sentences. With this book, and you know, it's columnists are notoriously arrogant. You know, they start getting this sort of omniscient view of the world. With this book, I was consciously as opposite of that as I could be, and stuck, you know, to volumes of documentation and of reading and corroboration. And so I'm very nervous of saying what Zbig would have done since May 2017. I'm really confident what he did up to May 2017, but he might well be changing his views quite a bit. He was a very supple mind.
The great thing about those, you can never be proven wrong if you make a declaratory statement. So it's fun for all of us in punditry, because we can stand on an uncontradictable set of propositions. Right? I want to give the audience a chance to questions in a minute, but I want to cover a couple more things. You know, you've emphasized the importance of geopolitics and how central that was. But the other thing that was striking to me about Dr. Brzezinski was that he, in some senses, he was a hedgehog, but as you were suggesting, I think, towards the end, he was also an incredible fox. And one of the places, as you point out about his not necessarily the greatest writer, one of his least well-written, but arguably one of the most important books, was on the technotronic society, right? And it's always struck me that when we think about the underappreciated features of Dr. Brzezinski's life and his strategy, was his very early appreciation about the transformative nature of what was happening in the technology revolution. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that, about how we thought about that, and the kind of impact that has on how he dealt with the emerging world.
It's a really key piece of his sort of evolution of his thinking. I mean, Ian grew up his summers in Maine, and he bought a house in Maine in the late 60s in Northeast Harbor called Big Catch, and after the moon landing, renamed it Tranquility Base. And that renaming explains a lot about how he saw America's technological prospects. And he became increasingly just disenchanted with the campus left, I think it's fair to say. Remember, this is the peak of, he's at Columbia, the 68 sort of sit-ins occur, first of all, at Columbia after MLK's assassination, then again after Chicago in the fall of 68, and then in 69 again. And he was actually famously confronted. There were a bunch of SDS, not a bunch, there were like a couple of thousand SDS protesters. And they had this pig, and the pig had Zbig daubed on the pig. Somebody had painted that. And the chant was, a pig for Professor Zbig. And nobody in the faculty would come. Deans are much braver nowadays. But in those days, they wouldn't go down. So Brzezinski says, I'll go down. In the meantime, I'm actually blending two stories, but this is not inaccurate. In the meantime, somebody had called, the police had come in, finally, and they'd called off, they'd managed to break up the march, and Brzezinski thinks, well, thankfully somebody's got some spine around here because this was getting violent. And it turns out it was an animal rights protester who said the pig was being mistreated. But he had a debate with the students. He said, I'll give you 10 minutes. And then that's it. And then after that, I've got to go back and plan some more genocide. And that was the kind of, so he liked engaging, but he he wasn't particularly impressed by how what he thought spoilt and bourgeois American students were. They had no idea what students were fighting for and being imprisoned for the other side of the Atlantic. He agreed with them on Vietnam eventually. It took him time, but he had a degree of contempt that I think other immigrants, not all of them, Stanley Hoffman wasn't one, but other immigrant scholars like Madeleine Albright had the same sort of feeling, which is you don't really know what freedoms you've got here. And if you think America is the worst of everything, you're just missing the bigger picture. And I think that was sort of his sense. And of course, what he saw in the Soviet Union enabled him to write all these sort of very scholarly, very influential articles, all translated behind the Iron Curtain, read, distributed with Politburo, saying, Leninist revolution is meant to be about the future. You're conservative. You've fallen behind. There's no technological revolution happening there. That's happening in America, and that's the technotronic revolution. That's the book he wrote. It's the computer revolution. And I think he was prescient on that.
So doing a bit of the tour of the world here, but another big place where Dr. Brzezinski had a very significant role and a controversial one was on the Middle East. And in the book you talk a little bit about his involvement and his strategy there and the issues around whether his approach to the Middle East and his engagement with, particularly with Arab countries, was characterized by some as anti-Semitism, and he was attacked for many quarters about that. How did that fit into his worldview, and how would you evaluate his efforts in the Middle East, especially given the outcome in Camp David?
Initially the attacks on him were that he was a Polish American, and that was from the WASP elites. The WASP elites felt that his Polishness made him inherently biased, and he would get America into a war with Russia for Poland. So that was the initial sort of thing he had to counter. Then when Carter sort of embarked upon Camp David, or in the build-up to Camp David, which we should remind ourselves was the first and most important ever Arab recognition of Israel, and the biggest Arab military power, Egypt. So a really, really major event. A lot of the sort of AIPAC types started finding sort of weak spots, and Brzezinski was an obvious weak spot. He was from Poland, sounded Polish, had long believed in what wasn't called a two-state solution, but a Palestinian homeland, had done this big Brookings paper before Carter became president. Carter had different motives for wanting an Arab-Israeli settlement. His was more about bringing peace to the Holy Lands. Brzezinski, it was about taking the Arabs out of the Soviet camp. It was a Cold War sort of move. But the irony of these attacks on him, and I don't think it was any basis to the allegations of anti-Semitism, but the irony of these attacks on him was that Carter could not stand Menachem Begin, the Israeli leader. So Brzezinski was the Begin whisperer, and they were quite similar characters, both speaking.
I'd love to ask Ian his thoughts on that one, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, well, I'm sure it's. I hope I'm being controversial, but they're both Polish speaking. They both had sort of quite strong sense of romance about small nations fighting against odds. So Brzezinski was the Begin whisperer, and help Carter retrieve that situation where he finally gets Sadat and Begin to agree on part one. The part two tragically fell apart. The Palestinian, moving towards a Palestinian homeland. And it really, really does look tragic in retrospect, but that fell apart. But he did feel the sort of sting of these allegations. They weren't from anybody mainstream, but there was a guy called Rabbi Schindler who was quite a sort of firebrand, and he would say it. One was a senator who would say it, and it really hurt him. But he felt sort of he felt it was quite hard to reply publicly without sort of making it worse. So he generally tried to ignore it.
So last one for me, and then I'll turn to all of you. So you mentioned in passing Iran, and arguably one of the non-successes of his tenure. Talk a little bit about how he came to his view about how to handle the crisis that emerged with the Shah's illness and the emerging revolutionary ferment in Iran.
So he saw, there was no real intelligence coming out of Iran. The deal with the Shah was you give us all these listening bases on the Iranian-Soviet border. So those were the listening posts, and that's where the Americans would monitor Soviet missile tests and the nuclear program. And in exchange, we're not going to spy on you domestically. And so there was no real forewarning of what was coming. And Carter uttered his most notorious sentence on New Year's Eve, 1977, on this long world trip that began in Poland, by the way. His first state visit was to Poland. I'm racking my brains as to why. And the next stop was Iran. And that night he toasted the Shah and said Iran was an island of stability. And 2 weeks later, the protests that led to the revolution and his ousting, a year after that, began. And they didn't know it was coming. The ambassador there, William Sullivan, famously took 3 months off that summer and said, this is stable for the next decade. And the DIA and the CIA described it as nothing to see here, move along. There were sort of notorious reports that Gary Sick, in his book, sort of goes into in some detail. Brzezinski, when the revolution started, saw this in the way he saw Western revolutions, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, which is ceding ground to the revolutionaries makes them worse. Kerensky never sticks around. The Robespierre is always coming. And so we must have a coup. The Iranian generals must, crack down, and there should be blood in the streets if necessary to prevent these weird mullahs who came from nowhere. Nobody had it in their playbook that revolutions were from the Middle Ages, that they were religious. That was the thing of the past. They came with Soviet tanks. So they were all blindsided, but Brzezinski, he gave some bad advice, one of which was to admit the Shah after he'd been ousted for medical treatment. And more recent history would have been useful there because the Shah had been put on the throne put back on the throne in 1953 by an American-British coup, which overthrew Mossadegh. So that, of course, the Shah going to America is going to stimulate the paranoia. A week afterwards, after the Shah is admitted for medical treatment, they storm the American embassy. These hostages get taken. I don't think the others, the William Sullivans, the State Department, got this right either. Brzezinski got it wrong. The State Department thought that Ayatollah Khomeini would be a Gandhi-like figure and should be part of and he would simply be a spiritual advisor. And the human rights violations that occurred from then on were 10 times worse. So everybody got it wrong, but Brzezinski also was very gung-ho for the hostage rescue operation, which of course failed in Desert One. It was devised by the Pentagon, harebrained scheme, but Brzezinski gave it his stamp. And so that was, and Carter gave me a written interview. He was already fading, so it was in writing, but he said, Brzezinski advised me badly on Iran. He was full of praise on the Cold War and China normalization, which Carter ranked as his greatest achievement. But on Iran, no, I think Brzezinski served him badly, but he was in good company.
Great. All right, let me open it up here. I don't know if we have mics available back there, but if not, you'll speak louder. I'll hand you my mic. So,
okay. Yeah.
Questions from the audience?
Not take it from you. Hi, my name's Cameron Thomas Shaw. I'm a DIA student. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk about Dr. Brzezinski's life. One thing that I've been quite curious about is his relationship with Secretary Condoleezza Rice. I understand that, at least on her part, there was admiration there, them both being Sovietologists and working together at the National Security Council very early on in her career. So, but I don't know much about his acceptance, his working with her, especially as a young African American woman working on the Soviet Union at a time where commonly she was kind of outside of the profile of generally those specialists. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It's a good question. He didn't interact an enormous amount with her. She was, as you say, a budding, rising Sovietologist. And then after that, post-Cold War foreign policy thinker. But he was really a bit of a thorn in her side because she was George Bush Jr.'s national security advisor and then Secretary of State. And Brzezinski, along with Bush Sr.'s former national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, this duo were way ahead of the Democratic Party, except there was a young senator from Illinois in 2002 who opposed the war. But basically, they were really quite laceratingly critical of the way the global war on terror was being prosecuted, the way in which this gave a get-out-of-jail-free card to the Putins, and the then, Hu Jintaos of this world, of countries to just declare dissidents as terrorists. And that's it. Well, we're all on the same side. We're fighting terrorism. And Brzezinski kept saying you cannot fight war on an abstract noun. So I think Condi Rice did not like, because it was quite effective criticism. But she has, and they dealt with each other quite a lot. He wasn't like frozen out. I mean, he'd come in. They cared more about Scowcroft, though, because Scowcroft was a friend of Bush Sr., and he was taken as speaking for Daddy Bush. But they interacted a lot, and I think there was a great mutual respect there. It's just that he was a bit of a thorn in the side.
Great. Other questions? Great opportunity here. Sorry, I can't see hands. The mic will come to people who raise their hands.
Yeah, hi. My name is Tom Hanshaw. I graduated in '81. I would be curious to hear what you think Brzezinski would think of the current administration's foreign policy. What would he make of it, just as on a general global level? Because I mean, it's a little bit chaotic from my perspective.
So this is my opportunity to tell you what I think and pretend it would have been what Zbig would have. What would Zbig do? WW something Z. I don't think he would have been impressed. To be a strategist, you need to sort of live, breathe, and think and learn the languages of the people you're engaging with, adversaries, friends. You need to seek knowledge. You need to be relentlessly curious. So I just think the rest of my question fills itself out. My answer to your question fills itself out.
Great. Go ahead.
My name is Anna, second-year international relations student here. So we live in historical times, and as a Ukrainian, and when you see an article saying we live in historical times, a lot of people in Ukraine would say, can we live in boring times? I have a question. Do you think that today we need strategists like Brzezinski as never before? And would you say maybe these times give birth to strategists like Brzezinski? Thank you.
It's a very good question. For sure, we need strategists, and we need to sort of give them, a more prominent place in the debate. And I think I've said this a few times before because it's variations of what you asked come up, which is it's not that America lacks for great brains. The universities are still very good, well-beating. There are lots of people who know a lot about China and about Russia and about the Middle East, etc. So it's not a supply problem, it's a demand problem. Washington's not particularly interested in, and it's not just Trumpian Washington I'm talking about. I mean, I do think that when Ben Rhodes used that sort of rather pejorative term, the blob, there was something to it. There is a sort of conformism, I think, to a lot of think tank thinking in this town that doesn't reward entrepreneurial thinking or not being a team player. And Brzezinski really was not a team player. He didn't belong to schools or groups or factions. He moved around as his mind took him. And I think it's less of a conducive climate for people like that today than it was in his time.
So let me stay with this for a minute because I think you can answer this as Ed Luce as opposed to what Zbig would have thought, which is there's a sort of a meme around town now that the era of U.S. global engagement is over, that this is not just a Trump moment, and that irrespective of who wins the midterms, who wins the next election, that the kind of role that the U.S. played and the kind of world that Zbig helped shape is just not coming back. And I just get you to reflect for a few minutes. one, if you think that's right, whether you think the American public broadly has lost its appetite for this kind of role as kind of world order or structure, and if so, what comes in its place?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a seriously important question. I wish I had a clear answer. My thoughts, my sort of half-formed thoughts are, the American public, I mean, foreign policy is, in terms of policy, the most autonomous of activities in any country. And, if you look at the Marshall Plan in the 40s, Gallup did a lot of polling on that. This was not popular with the American public, but it was able to be pushed through because their representatives, enough of them in both parties, understood the immense strategic value of this act of enlightened self-interest. So I don't think it's that there's always a consensus behind some of the things we approve of in big American foreign policy decisions. Certainly consensus against some of the things we disapprove of. I mean, Vietnam War was rightly really unpopular, and Iraq quite quickly became very unpopular. But I was in Latvia the other day, and I do tend to travel quite a lot. If an American president, if Trump had a road to Damascus and said, look, I really now understand Ukraine's predicament, and I'd like to get back onto this peace through strength idea that Reagan had, there would be standing ovations everywhere. It's not that the world is thinking, no, you're gone forever, and we don't want you. It's that the don't want you is not correct. They don't want Vietnam. They don't want the Iraq War, but they don't want blunders that America has committed, in my view. But they want the America that that is the founding member of NATO, for example. They want the America that was present at the creation of Bretton Woods and the United Nations, and they know that there's no other country that's going to do it. And this isn't just Western Europe I'm talking about. This is all over the world. So it's more a pessimistic prediction they're having. It's not a wish fulfillment.
Great. All right. We've taken up a lot of time. We've covered a lot of ground. I want to ask you all to join me in thanking Ed for a remarkable set of observations and an amazing book. Thank you for joining us.